Welcome to the future of sustainable food systems, an opportunity on your plate. So yes, we will be talking about food this morning. So I hope you've had a decent breakfast. We'll be talking about lovely fresh food, lovely fresh locally produced food like this at the Booths counter yesterday, but also about the wider food systems imports from all over the world, because the food system is very much a global affair. And this is on the eve of well, not on the eve, actually. This is a published report on exploring sustainable food systems, which Heike Schindingler is going to tell us about towards the end of the session. But first, a little bit about Arup. So Arup was founded by Sir Ove Arup back in 1946. Ove was a truly visionary engineer and architect whose vision was of total architecture, which we now think of as total design. The idea of bringing multidisciplines together to look at problems and solve problems in an integrated and collaborative way. So it's a very powerful vision of how the built environment should be designed. And we've shifted our lens in recent years very firmly towards sustainable development. So for Arup, sustainable development is everything. It's about finding a better way, making the right choices, and collaborating with others to make it happen. We have over 15,000 specialists now globally, 90 disciplines, 140 countries, 89 offices, and Arup, perhaps unusually, is an employee-owned business, which means that we do give truly independent advice. In Yorkshire, we have a proud history. We've had offices in Sheffield and Leeds for many years now, and we now have an office in York as well. We're probably best known for our projects, like Leeds Arena, designed by colleagues in the Leeds office. Leeds Flood Alleviation Scheme, there are the movable weirs at Nostrop that were installed a few years ago. We've done a huge amount of work with Yorkshire Water over the years. And Esholt Wastewater Treatment Works is one of our sort of flagship pieces of work with Yorkshire Water, very much looking at circular economy principles and renewable energy production. Bradford City Park, the project manager Niall's on the line with us today. A fantastic project, which was really at its best on Bonfire Night the other day. The Environmental Energy Technology Centre on the bottom left is an example of work we do in the energy space. That's an entirely energy neutral, carbon neutral building. So that wind turbine drives an electrolyser, which produces hydrogen, and then a fuel cell converts the gas to electricity and heat. So that's very much the direction in which we're going in. We do an awful lot of work with the Environment Agency, and that Skips and Flood Alleviation Scheme. We've got a programme of flood alleviation works across Yorkshire at the moment being delivered as part of their capital programme. And that's resulting in us needing to look up catchment into the catchments and into farmland and so forth to to help solve the problems of flooding. We also do a lot of advisory work. And some examples of some of the sort of advisory pieces that we've issued in recent years that are relevant to this are there, including our work with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And Kate Jackson, I think, is on the line, who's doing a lot of work in the region on circular economy principles, including, I think, a bit of collaboration with Andrew Griffiths, who we'll hear from in a minute. But the water business in Leeds is really what kicked off the water business in Arup, which is now sort of £90 million business globally. And we've done a lot of work around as thought leadership around integrated water cycle management, and looking at the catchment is one important aspect of that. So food production and agriculture is a very big part of what we do with water companies and with the Environment Agency. And we're working with Yorkshire Water at the moment with the hydrogeology teams on looking at nutrient issues and water supply. So here we are in Yorkshire, some familiar scenes there. from Whernside and Pennygent, the three peaks up there in the top left. These areas are subject to, at the moment, subject to some quite exciting projects around proposals for rewilding and sort of nature recovery. And then in the middle there, we've got Ilkley Moor, which has just had a major programme of natural flood management features put on it to try and arrest the peat deterioration and slow the flow of runoff. On the left, the cow there, it's sort of in-by land, a lot of beef and livestock production in the Dales and the North York Moors. And then top right, we've got the Vale of York and the Wolds, and some of the most sort of intensive agribusiness, arable land in the country, and very productive land it is. And then the bottom right, you've got the lowlands, the Humber Head levels, very productive peatlands, ex-peatlands, but very reliant on land drainage and flood defence to keep the soil sort of moisture in good shape. So 12,000 kilometres squared Yorkshire, 70% of that, roughly, very roughly, is agricultural land. 5.4 million people. If I got my maths right, I did this in bed last night, that's about 0.17 hectares per person, so not a great deal. So it's very clear that in terms of moving towards a sustainable food production, if we wanted to be self-sufficient, that's going to be a real challenge, and it will require very close attention to sort of circular economy and principles. There's been a lot of work done in this space, and it was very disappointing in a way that COP26 remained quite silent on the issue of food. The National Food Strategy was a really groundbreaking and fantastic piece of work, which looked holistically at all aspects of food, from diets and school meals right the way through to how we produce the food. And I've just taken one picture from that just to set the scene, to contextualise things. And I like this. This is not showing where the stuff's produced. It's showing the makeup of the food that we consume in this country and the land use areas. And what it's showing is that a vast area is used for beef and lamb pasture. A surprisingly tiny amount is used for orchards up there, right at the top, fruit and veg. But on the right hand of the picture is what we need to import. And that's a staggering volume of food. So some really interesting challenges and issues in this space at the moment, and I'm absolutely delighted that we've got a very illustrious panel of individuals who can tell us a bit more about what's going on. So I will now introduce you to the panel. So I'll turn off the slides, and if the panel could reveal yourselves, and I will ask you to introduce yourselves in turn. So Tim, first, could you say hello?
Morning, everybody. Tim Benton, Research Director at Chatham House, part-time professor at University of Leeds, and I've been working on sustainable food systems and food security and climate change and biodiversity, etc. all my academic life. Over.
Brilliant. Andrew.
Yes, morning everyone. I'm Andy Griffiths, Head of Value Chain Sustainability for Nestlé's business in the UK and Ireland, driving a range of different outcomes and programmes, but particularly focused on regenerative agriculture and food system transformation.
Brilliant, thanks very much. And Emily?
Good morning, everybody. Emily Norton, Head of Rural Research at Savills. 20 plus years experience in actual farming, including used to make cheese for a living. Now very heavily involved in thinking about the changing dynamics and economics around land use across the UK and making sense of those policy and market drivers for 3.5 million hectares of land, 3.5 million acres of land, which is how much Savills manages every year. Thank you. Brilliant,
thanks Emily. And then finally, last but not least, Eike.
Hi, I'm Eike Sindlinger and I lead food and agriculture systems in Arup. I'm by background an architect and urban designer, and I first got interested when I was herding cows in Toxteth, of all places. I got really interested about the relationship between food and the built environment, and I'm also been heavily involved in the report that Will mentioned earlier.
Brilliant, well thanks very much. So could I now ask Eike and Emily and Andrew to turn off your videos, and we will pass over to Tim, who will kick us off.
Okay, thank you very much, Will. Okay, so I've been asked to talk a little bit about the perspective around food security and the key challenges. And I'd like to just start off by saying there is not a challenge about how to feed the world. There's not a challenge about how to provide enough food. There is a challenge about the fragility of our globalized food system. And perhaps the biggest challenge that we face is that our current food system increasingly undermines our health and well-being, both locally and globally. So just tackling the two kind of key questions that are which are begged by my brief. What do we mean by food security, and what do we mean by sustainability? So first, what is food security? Is it about access to whatever food you want at a price you like that the markets can supply you? Or is it about access to a diet that makes you healthy and is diverse and nutritious? Those two things are slightly contrasting, and very obviously in places like COP, there is a kind of move towards thinking that food security is about the market supplying whatever people want to eat, rather than about supplying whatever will make people happy and healthy. And likewise, the second question, is sustainability about minimizing the impact of agricultural production whilst meeting the market demand? Or is it about living within the boundaries of what can be produced sustainably and changing our demand to fit that? You end up with very different visions for and pathways to the future, depending on the assumptions that you make in answering these questions. So where are we now? Well, over the last decades, we have constructed a food system, the market, its regulation and its social license, based on the kind of notion that more is better and cheaper is good. And this cheaper food paradigm drives a whole set of overlapping and often self-reinforcing mechanisms in which we're driving up production all the time, liberalizing global markets, getting involved in very long supply chains, and creating the incentives for economic behavior that leads to negative outcomes for society and the environment. So just briefly, the concentration and intensification of agriculture that we have used as our primary driver has driven down the cost of staples such as grains, which are now sufficiently cheap that we can divert them from human consumption to farmed animals. That makes meat cheaper and drives up the consumption of meat, with negative consequences for air and water quality and greenhouse gas emissions. The cheaper calories that come from our small group of staple crops have become increasingly abundant, while more nutritious crops have become more expensive and relatively less available. These trends together have led to a rapid change and convergence in global diets, including an increase in the overconsumption of calories and the underconsumption of nutrients that has resulted in diet-related ill health being the major cause of ill health and mortality on a global basis, and increasingly in the UK. And as food prices have fallen, it has become increasingly economically rational to waste food, which is now occurring at scale from farm to flush. The more prices fall, the more food we demand and the more food we waste, and the more food we waste, the more we want cheaper food and demand more. And of course, as the per capita availability of food has increased, so have the greenhouse gas emissions from the food system, now accounting for 35% of total global emissions. And of course, the food system is a key driver of climate change, which drives its impacts on agriculture and wider society, and a key driver of biodiversity loss. And then finally, as globalized supply chains, which are there in the name of producing more and cheaper food, they are all typically just-in-time supply chains with the properties that give resilience, redundancy, diversity, decentralization, and flexibility stripped out in the name of efficiency. So we built this food system, which actually ends up giving us the wrong sorts of things, an obesogenic diet with high environmental impacts. And therefore, there are a lot of calls for transformation of the food systems. But there are two contrasting visions for the future that are obvious in current discourse. The first one is based on business as usual, the system that we have, but making it a bit better. And this is typically the one that you will hear reported in a whole range of different sorts of meetings. And that is, well, we've got to meet the demand that's growing because we've got more people in the world. How best to kind of save nature? Well, let's stop deforesting. If we're stopping deforesting, then agriculture is not going to expand. But as demand is going, we have to intensify the land we have, which is all about sustainable intensification. If we are going to change diets, it's not really about a health focus. It's much more about how can we increase the environmental efficiency. So thinking about going from beef to chicken to beans. But, you know, this is a market-driven vision. We'll have vegan and insect burgers. We'll have alternative proteins. We will have globalized supply chains still based on ultra-processed foods, with the primary ingredients being the major commodity crops. And it's all around economic growth and economic growth of the sector with engineering, with nutrition engineered in. The alternative vision is one that has less traction, but it starts with the premise that we need to fit demand within the Earth system's limits and local sustainability. And we also need dietary change for health. And it's about valuing food for all of its important attributes, not just about making the price as cheap as possible. And in this vision, people are willing to change diets, change towards more whole foods, more fruit and vegetables, less meat, collectively reducing pressure on land, allowing space for nature. Instead of intensive agriculture in a small portion of the land, we have integrated agricultural landscapes, land sharing, if you like, with diverse, heterogeneous farmscapes with space for nature, rotations and so on, with a vital role for ruminants. And the higher values associated with food are translated into higher farm gate prices. The dietary discussion is based on healthy diets, less but better, less beef, but beef from agroecological approaches, avoiding grain-fed livestock, whole foods, plants, rich and diverse. More consideration by citizens given to the values of food, its quality, diversity, sourcing impacts, reducing waste, eating differently. And some studies have suggested that household food expenditure can actually decrease if you're eating in a new and different way. And this vision also has less reliance on globalized supply chains, perhaps more regional or local food networks, and will probably be more resilient because it's less just in time. So from my perspective, the challenges around sustainable food security are less about having an excess of food and driving productivity, more about having the right sorts of food. Less about making everything as cheap as possible, but more about getting diets right for health, less ultra-processed foods, more fruit and vegetables, more whole foods. Integrating active travel, work and food environments in a sustainable way. For example, a marginal change in diabetes rates in our area could save enough money to pay every farmer to farm differently. We have to focus more on building robust food environments, food communities and food cultures. COVID has illustrated the importance of local food networks and social environments. It's not so much about where food is grown that we consume as what is grown, how it's grown and how we use the food. The challenge, in my view, is not about growing more to feed the world. The real crisis is changing what we grow to nourish the world, people and the planet. And recognizing the systemic value of getting our food right is really important through reducing ill health, reducing waste, reducing environmental harms and climate change. And to a certain extent, this requires tackling incumbency and ideology. And that includes market actors and the role of market in delivering these things, as opposed to the social benefits that come from getting it right. Okay, so that's my whistle-stop tour. I'll leave it there. Will, back to you.
That's fantastic, Tim. And yeah, I know which version of the world is your preferred version, and I know that I share that view. But for me, it's inequality in access to education and to money, in terms of the cost of living, and the way of living. If you're an inner city person with 3 jobs on minimum wage, it is quite challenging to feed yourself in a creative way that perhaps the sort of more wealthy and educated. I mean, to be brutally frank about it, there is in that food report, there is a graph which shows that there's a very clear link between income and education and the people who eat the most fruit and veg and nutritious
So if I can respond to that just briefly, at the moment, the world grows about a third of the fruit and vegetables that it should grow if everyone to eat a healthy diet. So we bias the system towards calories as opposed to nutrition. Yeah. And we could invest just as much in producing fruit and vegetables, so it became cheap. The second point is there's no such thing as food poverty, in the sense that there is poverty, and if people cannot afford to eat a healthy diet now, then that's because they're not getting paid enough. And so that's a systemic issue. It's not a food supply issue. And the third thing I would say is, and I said this at a meeting in Glasgow, we need to transition the system in a just way to deal with the inequality issue. But maintaining the current system is deeply, deeply unjust as it is, because the diets available for the sort of demographic you're talking about are shockingly bad, and they tend to be associated with slower, less development in school because of poor nutrition as a child, through to obesity and the diseases associated with it from a calorie-rich diet in adulthood and the lifelong implications that has. So you end up with a situation where we've got to change the system from an inequality perspective. Let's change the system in the way that actually manages the health and the environmental implications at the same time.
Thanks so much, Tim. Right, that's bang on time for Andrew to share his slides and give his perspective from the.
Can everyone see the slides?
We can, Victoria. Thanks.
Fabulous. Thank you.
If you put it on presentation mode.
Yes.
Excellent. That's great. So thanks to Tim. A great start to the session, and really sets up the rest of the session in terms of other perspectives and how we can build and deliver this transformation within our food systems. So if we jump onto the next slide. So again, as Tim alluded to, our current food systems are incredibly complex and are also interdependent with a whole range of other systems as well. So it's clear that our food systems are not only having an impact in terms of climate change and decline in biodiversity, but also the social impacts as well, but are also critically impacted by climate change and the decline in biodiversity. So really it's crucial for those actors within the food sector to drive change to ensure that we have successful business models for the future as well. So this is effectively an existential risk for businesses in the food sector. But when you look at the complexity of these systems, it's really important that we enable all actors within the food system to play their role. But it can be difficult for those organisations, particularly the smaller actors, to determine which levers to pull to help enable that transition. So if we move on to the next slide. So really, from our perspective, and as part of the work we did with the UN GEO6 team, looked at what were the key actions, almost no regret or low regret actions that organisations could take to transition the food systems. So the first one sounds obvious: act strategically, measure and track progress. But what's really important here is that rather than seeing the impact of our food systems from an environmental and social perspective as bolt-ons, it's really understanding the importance of those to our business models and integrating them fully within those business models. So we're taking strategic action to drive that transformation and understand how we're performing against it. The second one is supporting the transition to a nature positive production. So looking at, again, Tim's point, how we can enable the transition to agroecological or regenerative agricultural practices within our supply chain. And clearly larger organisations such as ours have a key role to play in terms of supporting farmers and land managers to deliver that transition, but in a way which is farmer and community centric. It's crucial that we enable those individuals and organisations to play a key role in shaping and delivering that transition, not just from a just perspective, but also in terms of making sure we optimise those solutions within the landscape. Thirdly, that we contribute towards a shift to a more nutrient-rich and plant-based diets, but again, recognising the role of all of the different components of a healthy diet from a personal perspective, and also in terms of the environmental impact as well, and recognising, against Tim's point, the important role of ruminants within that. So this isn't just about transitioning away from meat and dairy, but looking at how we rebalance diets effectively. And then finally, to reduce food loss and waste. So again, as Tim mentioned, we're seeing significant amount of food not arriving at or not being consumed by the end consumer. So looking at how we can reduce food loss and waste across the value chain as a whole. And it's really crucial that we take these actions, because when you look at most food businesses, the bulk of our footprint will be in our upstream supply. So the opportunity to support regenerative agriculture will clearly help address that footprint. By looking at rebalancing our diets, again, we can reduce the load on landscapes. And also by reducing food loss and waste, we can reduce the demand in terms of agricultural systems by taking that demand out of the system. So a range of benefits, not just in terms of emissions, but in terms of multifunctional outcomes within the landscape, reducing that demand for land use, reducing the demand for water use, and reducing associated emissions. If we move on to the next slide. Obviously, from a transition perspective, it's crucial that we recognise, although there are large organisations like us, and obviously the food sector as a whole is a large sector, we really need to look at how we can leverage relationships across sector to deliver this transformation. And this is really where we can look at organisational interests within the landscapes within which we operate and within which we source, and using principles similar to the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure and the evolving Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, help those organisations to understand their dependencies on the landscapes. So those functional dependencies, whether it be around water quality, whether it be around water availability, whether it be about air quality, access to nature from a recreational perspective, will typically all flow back to the same assets within those landscapes. So actually, by helping organisations to understand those dependencies, we can come together and co-fund the transition to more regenerative landscapes. And the benefit there is, by taking that approach, we can crowd in the interest from water utility companies, linear infrastructure, housing, as well as food sectors, to really drive efficient investment into those landscapes, supporting farmers and land managers to deliver that transition in a way which is community centric, but in a way which also delivers real economic efficiency and therefore scale as well. And using models like the Landscape Enterprise Network model, we can crowd in those farmers and land managers to help support that transition. But also on the demand side, we can blend the funding solutions, not just from the private sector, but also leverage public funding as well to deliver efficiency for the public purse as well as business interest. If we move on to the next slide. So just in terms of an example, when we're talking about multifunctional landscapes and those shared interests, if we look, for example, at hedgerows, an intervention which many farmers can implement within their fields. From the work that's been done with Leeds University, we've been able to evidence that hedgerows actually sequester significantly more carbon than previously believed. But actually, as well as delivering carbon benefits, by effectively selecting the right interventions, like, for example, hedgerow planting in certain landscapes, you can deliver a whole range of other outcomes. If you want to click on one more. And those outcomes may be in terms of water quality, water availability, reduced flood risk, access for recreation, or other physical feedstocks for other businesses. And what that means is those functional outcomes are of interest to a whole range of other organisations. So again, the opportunity to bring those organisations together to co-fund that transition makes things much easier, much more effective. So if we move on one more. So what does that mean for Yorkshire? Clearly, from a lens perspective specifically, we've seen significant growth across the UK, now into mainland Europe and evolving into the global south as well, developing core propositions to enable that transition to multifunctional landscapes and transforming our food systems as part of that transition. Clearly, as was mentioned earlier from Will, Yorkshire is one of our key, arguably, breadbaskets for the UK, where we have significant agricultural interests, but also a range of other interests in terms of water supply and recreational interests. So for me, a core opportunity to start rethinking how we manage the landscapes within Yorkshire and bring together a range of cross-sector actors to support that transition, both in terms of landscape change and in terms of transitioning our food systems as a whole. Thanks.
Brilliant. Excellent. Thanks a lot, Andrew. As you're aware, I'm really excited by the lens model, and I think a lot of us are. So thanks for sharing that with us. So, Emily, we bring up Emily's slides. I think it probably works if you keep your videos on as well.
My name is Emily Norton. Introduced myself at the beginning. I'm here to kind of perhaps give a bit of view of how this is going to impact on farmers and this transition to a sustainable food future. So I'm going to just cover three key things quite quickly in the next 8 minutes or so. How we got to where we are in farming, how we got to the broader socio-economic context that influences food, and then what farmers need to do to surf the transition wave into a sustainable future. So modern agriculture, as the slide in front of you shows, is a product of revolutions. You know, it is obvious, but it's worth stating. Agriculture and the broad economy have evolved in tandem, but fundamentally the advances in agriculture and land use have enabled the broader transformation of the economy to an industrialised one. So we know the first revolution was settling down and starting to farm. The second revolution, if you click on one, was really that transition away from kind of direct labour on the land in order to get to you know, a higher economy type setting, characterised by better wages, a safer labour environment than field or animal work, and the end of famine fundamentally, for other than for political reasons, as we see around the globe still. Now, moving through, we then get to the Green Revolution and this idea of modern agriculture being you know, dependent upon external inputs. And then finally, this last one, the digitalization of agriculture. It's the hardest one and has occurred in most other sectors before it's really come back to the farming, food and farming sector. And big data is really needed to make sense of the complexity of our agricultural and food systems, as some of these other reports have shown. But it's also really indicative of the low value return to agriculture from food production and those high value returns that technology tend to chase. How we're realising those within our farming systems, our food systems specifically, means that the rollout and the implementation of technological solutions isn't always an obvious one. So moving on to the next slide, what's driving this farm level productivity? What's driven this kind of massive kind of focus on in the intensification of all of these systems? And it's the low value piece that's really critical to understanding that, and also where we might be going next with all of this stuff. So most people, when you imagine a chicken farm, you're going to see the image on the left, a parochial image of chickens scratching around a yard. But the reality of modern intensive poultry production is, of course, extreme in comparison and something more akin to the centre. Now, this is a product of evolution. There's no one single cause which has sort of transitioned the entire system towards focusing on this. But it's the economic value system around food which really is the core driver of the political effectiveness of this system. So on the right, I know you won't be able to see this in detail, but there is an extract from the EU's indicators of social deprivation. Obviously, if you want to ensure that people have access to protein every second meal, which is one of those core indicators, you can either make them wealthier, and this point has been made before, and Tim was just making this point in conversation, or you can make that protein cheaper. And it's that focus, that laser focus on making food cheaper, that's driven some of these fairly extreme outcomes within our food system from a production point of view that people are now quite understandably rebelling against. Now, Henry Dimbleby did a reasonable job of picking up on some of these root drivers without, I don't think, really getting to the bottom of what's causing it. In my opinion, I think it could have gone much further, that food strategy, at tackling some of those political economic settings rather than the food system and the negative food system consequences of what we're seeing at top level. So if we move on to the next slide. So look, we know that the Common Agricultural Policy, first box please, has focused, and this is the trans system we're moving away from, it's focused on fair standard of living to farmers and a fair cost of food to consumers. And it's resulted in a sector which is excessively dependent upon income support, in my opinion, and without supply chain investment in farm systems in order to drive multifunctional outcomes. Equally, if we move on, the market economy in which we exist has legitimised the price of food to the consumer being the dominant factor, as we've just seen, including in whether businesses are acting competitively or not. And this is this idea of the consumer welfare standard, which drives decisions around whether people are colluding on price. I mean, it basically makes it impossible for farmers to say we want a better price for what we're producing, please, in order to make these outcomes fairer. And there's a narrow definition around producer organisations, for example, which allow them to bargain within that process, but it fundamentally embeds structural asymmetry as the standard within supply chain relations. And farmers will always feel that they are done unfairly as a result, because they just don't have the ability to bargain with the highly concentrated supply chains, both upstream and downstream of where they are. So we know all of these negative costs of unsustainable food production that have already been mentioned, from health to pollution to waste, are left outside the price of food, and they're not reflected in there. The core problem in my mind is that none of these new policy mechanisms that we see at the bottom of the screen there, that, you know, they're all coming in as a result of Brexit, but none of them really look like they're going to tackle this. Expansion of the producer organisations regime may do a little bit, but it won't make the general principles of contract law fairer within agricultural supply chains. The introduction of polluter pays within the Environment Act may also help, but as it's not applying to Treasury, it's of limited clout because we can't really use the finance system or the tax system in order to drive revenues. And levelling up is a major headache when energy prices and general resources are the causes of an awful lot of consumer stress at the moment. And I think from that perspective, food will remain a welfare policy for the foreseeable future, and we don't really see that changing, and farmers are probably just going to have to get used to it. So if we move on to the next slide. What can farmers do to transition to a sustainable agricultural future? Farmers can only really worry about what they can control, okay? So a lot of these big picture economic pieces largely feel a bit remote to the day-to-day decision making. However, as the tectonic plates shift post-Brexit, there are opportunities, and I think this is really important. So hopefully you haven't got them all up. We should be on number 1 at the moment, please. Take responsibility, whether it's for carbon pollution or simply business viability. Government has signalled that it's up to individual farms, not government, to ensure viability. You need to work out what your impacts are and work out how to reduce them. And it really is that focus on taking self-responsibility at farm level that I think is a bit of a difference. Too many farmers are waiting for somebody else to tell them what to do in order to make sense of all this stuff. Number 2, farming needs to see itself as a service, providing food or other outputs that meet the market's needs for assurance, disclosure, impact on information or other data. Equally, as we transition past the basic payment scheme, supply chains need to realise that no one is underwriting risk at farm level anymore. That basic payment scheme check that provided cash liquidity for next year's harvest is going. So if a biscuit maker wants biscuit wheat next year, it cannot rely that growers will continue to finance the creation of and risk in that crop. So understanding that there's a service that needs to be provided, but it works both ways, is key to understanding how you're going to make it through this. Number 3, farmers need to get smart as to where food is heading. In my mind, mass-produced commodity protein does not stack up well against a number of core environmental or social criteria, as has already been pointed out. And it's also the area that is most likely to be disrupted by technology. It's really not that far away. This utopian vision of it all being okay and we'll all transition to a regenerative agriculture is nonsense in my mind. People need to eat, and technology will continue to disrupt this sector in a global sense, because this is not just the UK, these are global commodity supply chains around protein, and that will come. The cheapest end of the market will continue to get higher, and more ultra processed and good food will remain at a premium, in my opinion. Number 4, farmers therefore in the UK farmers need to focus on maximising the value of their systems, and that they are custodians of, and see it as a sense of custodianship. Regenerative agriculture is the way forward, but actually that's just a return to 1950s farming with 21st century technology. Thinking back to those revolutions that we started with, it's more farming 2.1 than farming 4.0. Yeah, we've got to get back to basics on this stuff. It has been done wrong recently, and we have to take responsibility for that, and that can't carry on. That is, again, about painting a picture of what we want to do as an industry and as a sector to provide good quality food and to meet these challenges of sustainable agriculture going forwards. Number 5, and this is possibly the controversial one, particularly to people in farming, is that we as UK farmers looking at sustainable food and sustainable systems going forward, we need to excel at what we're good at and stop trying to be all things to all people. Trade is inevitable, and a more positive vision of how food and resources can be traded around the world to spread risk and maximise sustainability value would be a much healthier approach than we are having on this discourse in this country at the moment, which is incredibly defensive and defensive of the status quo. And I do think that farmers in general, there is a large progressive group within them who do realise that things need to change, and the shift to regenerative agriculture really is kind of central to that and how you can take more control. On a small, crowded and hungry island, there are multiple opportunities on our doorstep, and one that smart, sustainable farming can champion by getting ahead of the game and enabling a no net impact sustainable economy to really dominate going forwards. And as we have enabled those other economic transitions in the past, now is the role of land management and farming in general to enable a new version of sustainable land management for the future that does provide a no net loss, a no net impact economy to exist. That is me done. Thank you very much.
Well done. That was a marathon, but great. Thanks so much, Emily. We must move swiftly on to Iker.
Hi, yes, thank you. But Tim, Andy, and Emily, that's fascinating. Victoria, if you could put the slides up.
1 second. Yeah, 1 second.
Sure.
I was just, people are still joining, which is good.
So this is going to be recorded. I'm not quite sure what we're going to do with the recording, but we'll be able to make it available to people somehow.
We will, yeah.
We've got a lot of questions. There's only going to be a time for a couple, but I'm reading through them and I'll try and pin out the key points. But if anyone has any time to respond in the chat to the questions, do go ahead.
Can you see the slides?
Not
We
yet.
can't just yet, no.
Oh.
I've learned one thing, and there it is. The future of our food system is actually exciting. I think everyone before outlined the big challenges, and it's unprecedented challenges the food system faces, both as a main driver for climate change, but also a main victim of it, you could say. And we're seeing the fourth revolution's already mentioned, it's transformation at speed. Policy, everything changes. Now, that's daring and daunting, but actually it's a unique opportunity to really create a sustainable and resilient and equitable food system at the same time. Next slide, please. So in working at this report, we looked at what could a future food system which does all of those wonderful things look like. And we did it in 4 segments around the food circle. So we looked at rethinking agriculture, we looked at the growing, therefore processing and distribution, then obviously us, the consumers, and then making it circular. Next slide, please. In rethinking agriculture, starting with the growing end, I want to highlight 2 really challenges and trends. One, it's the colossal environmental impact of conventional farming and the scary thought of soil depletion. So there are some clever people suggest we only have 60 harvests left if we continue what we're doing. Next slide, please. And there are kind of 3 areas I want to see what the future could be like. So 2 main strains emerging in terms of growing. One is regenerative agriculture, which really focuses on soil health, and both Emily and Andy mentioned that. But I think that's not only great because it does all the wonderful environmental things and it can provide food naturally in perpetuity, but I think there is also the high-tech element, the kind of controlled environment agriculture in there, which really promises reliability, predictability, and actually high-level intensive production with very little land use and very little water use. Next slide, please. Another trend we noticed is the localization and the beginning of a bioregional approach. We see consumers have a growing interest in localized production and a diversified supply. there is potential by doing so to integrate food growing with the urban infrastructure and therefore closing some nutrient cycles and some resource loops which we currently can't close. Next slide, please. And the one element we found in looking at growing is also that we haven't really looked at the sea, not in terms of just extracting fish, but in kind of regenerative farming. That's not without its challenges, but I think there's a big potential for large-scale regenerative mariculture, what we discovered. Next slide, please. Now, looking at the supply chain, so everything from processing to distribution, we found two things, key drivers here. One is the vulnerability to shock. We've seen that in the pandemic and more recently with the shortages of drivers. And I think the other thing we're observing is the demand for traceability and accountability. Next slide, please. So that's already mentioned by Emily. There's a big driver towards digitization and big data. And that means use of technologies like blockchain to increase efficiency, but also to increase the traceability. It also can be used to enhance food safety and biosecurity, because if you know where a product's coming from, you can see the whole kind of chain and how things come together. And it's going to be a vital tool in building trust by providing transparency. Next slide, please. Big issue in this sector is also decarbonization. We're not seeing that only about decarbonizing factory and the processes, but also a big rise in innovative technology in terms of refrigeration. Now, that's an optimization mechanism, but it has a huge impact if you think about how long and how complex those cold chains can be. And lastly, we're seeing decarbonization of shipping, electrification, and of course, last mile delivery. You've probably seen those kind of electric bikes replacing trucks in your area. Next slide, please. And we're seeing another trend in there, which is interesting, which is about localization and decentralization. That means at the one end, we see producers moving the factory to the field to make a fresher product. And at the other end, we're seeing processing and production being closer to the consumer to get a kind of specific brand. Like if you take the microbreweries, but also coffee brands and so forth and so forth. Next slide, please. Now to the heart of things, to all of us, the consumer and sustainable consumption. What could that look like? And the two issues I want to highlight from the long list here is the issue of trust and transparency, which I mentioned before, but also the link between nutrition and health that I think Tim spoke about very eloquently, and the importance of that. Next slide, please. So what could that look like? And I think there is this concept of food citizenship we see in rising here. I think it's a really well sort of encapsulating a lot of the things that Tim and Andy and as well Emily spoke about. It's creating this closer relationship between consumer and producer. There are digital platforms which are facilitating this connection, and there is an idea of sharing risk, time and resource. Community supported agriculture is one way of how that can happen, but I think there's a recognition that this sharing needs to happen. Next slide, please. I mentioned already health, and I want to be specific about food as medicine. We've got a better understanding how integral nutrition is to our health and our well-being. And you can see when I talked about controlled environment agriculture, you have the ability to customize flavors. Now, when I hear flavor in plants, I think about medicinal properties, and there is a real opportunity to customize health properties in plants. But there is also a bigger aspect. There is this idea of personalizing meals to suit individual biomes and kind of make sure that what we eat is a very healthy diet. Next slide, please. And then there are new products and new ways of consumption, which we all observe and are probably more familiar with. So one is the acceptance of novel foods. Tim talked about this earlier. There's the cultivated meat, the insect protein. This is one element of it. And we've seen obviously a drive spurred on by COVID to more online and convenience shopping. But there are also things about communal preparation, less so in pandemic times, but just generally, there's a trend of people getting together and people making more hyper-local food choices, so which is an important brand. If you go to the next slide, please. Now, the last bit, we'll look at closing in the loop. And this is really the elephant in the room, the big amount of food waste that Tim mentioned earlier. A third of all food's wasted. And if food waste was a country, some people have said it would be the third largest in the world in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a big issue and it needs tackling. And the trends we're seeing here, if you move to the next slide, first, we got to look at ways how we can reduce waste so that we're not having any of it, or as little as we can. There are food rescue and redistribution projects going on all of the time. There is initiatives around zero waste catering, and we're seeing a trend in consumer habits are changing, accepting of wonky veg, and just generally driving towards buying more what you need. Next slide, please. But unfortunately, we won't be able to get rid of all food waste. So we need to think about nutrient recovery and how we make food actually food waste either into a byproduct or turn it back into nutrients and make food the ultimate circular resource. Next slide, please. And then, of course, we've got to deal something about packaging, and we're seeing trends there about the need to reduce the need for packaging using something like organic edible coatings to improve shelf life. Or we're seeing, of course, a big trend towards replacing any plastics and non-recyclables with biodegradables. Next slide, please. So what does it really mean for Yorkshire and the Humber? Well, when we discussed the relevance of this report for the local region, our first thought was it really needs a holistic thinking about the whole food system and at a bioregional scale. And we also thought we need to include materials in that thinking because that's where it kind of creates opportunities. Second thought was we need to include the sea. When we discussed this, the tidal marshlands offer an opportunity to use oyster farming for flood defenses, but there is also, Will made this really important point that the salt marshes might actually be one of the most productive agricultural landscapes in terms of protein per hectare, kilogram of protein per hectare, if you look at them actively and treat that way. And the last point is really that we should really use a food lens because it's accessible for everyone to create integrated strategies. So whether it's circular economy, whether it's carbon, whether it's health, public health, or whether it's the landscapes, the beautiful landscapes and how we manage them, food can be the thing that brings all of them together. And with that, I say thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Eike, and thanks to all the speakers. So we've got time for a few. I'm afraid there are lots of great questions here, and we're not going to have time for all of them, but I'm just going to pick out one or two. There's a good point here from Claire. Some of the most sustainable food systems I've seen, including getting healthy food in the most disadvantaged parts of our society, have been through localized grassroots businesses. How can we support these types of business? And I think it's pretty shocking the extent that the lack of horticulture and the lack of the market garden. Most market gardens in this country on the town fringes have been turned into park and rides. What are your thoughts, Tim, on how we could encourage these sort of localized models of local produced food and the city and town margins?
Well, first things first, I think it is a myth that a healthy diet has to be expensive. We published a paper the other day that was written up on the website, on the Guardian website, about meat consumption. That was the way they took about it. But actually, a healthy plant-rich diet can be cheaper than a conventional diet, and a diet of whole foods can be cheaper than a diet of convenience food in plastic packaging bought from a supermarket. The challenge really is how do you scale those up? How do you, particularly, as you mentioned earlier, Will, with people who are impoverished, and I'm based in London at the moment, many of the blocks of flats that are available for low-income families don't have a kitchen, or they have a kitchen that is the size of the desk I'm sitting at the moment with just a microwave on. So how do you inculcate, educate the ability to eat lentils and fresh vegetables that could come from local markets, as opposed to going into a supermarket and buying something in a plastic package that's full of calories and not very much else? I think if you take a whole systems view and a cross-government view, as I mentioned earlier, the healthcare challenges of our poor diets are absolutely bankrupting the health service. They're contributory to the enormous cost that we're putting into healthcare. We've got higher levels of obesity than anywhere else in Europe. Our food is cheaper than anywhere else in Europe. High levels of COVID mortality is associated with the fact that we have high obesity. So getting the healthcare and moving towards a preventative healthcare framing based around better diets can provide the seed money, the incentive money to create local food networks in ways that, some governments around the world are already stimulating allotment farming and local food communities because of the healthcare benefits associated with it. So it's a matter of being joined up in our thinking about policy rather than just saying it's a market solution and it's got to be left to the market.
Sure. But Emily, I mean, could you come in there in terms of what are the obstacles to landowners adopting this kind of model? Because if you've got a farm on the city margins, on the margins of a town, there is an opportunity for you there to have a more engaging and engaged community-focused model, which could actually be extremely lucrative a way of producing food in collaboration with local communities. What are the blockers to farmers picking up those kinds of opportunity?
I think some of the blockers are really boring things around tax and tenancy law, and actually having a much more progressive system of sharing assets and sharing land would really help. The current system of administration works best when you've got one individual actor acting as a tenant farmer, trying to create community interest models or shared occupation models in that context. Not only causes a headache in terms of the sort of access to land perspective, it's then the air sucking that your accountant will do from a tax perspective. And those other multifunctional values that we place upon land, which are completely hidden from the food system, which tend to cause some problems in this space. And it really is a classic issue of, we've got all of these problems over here and these sort of fundamental constraints over here, and the two really need to work together. Otherwise, it's very pie in the sky. So all of it is very, very possible, but you need to create a permissive system where it's actively encouraged rather than dissuaded on the basis of a very risk-averse sector.
Brilliant. So we've run out of time in terms of our allotted time slot. So feel free to leave now if you so wish. There will be a recording, and Victoria will be in touch with all attendees to give a link to where that recording is. And we'll try and I don't think there's any reason why we wouldn't try and distribute this quite widely. Are you speakers happy to take another couple of questions for those who want to stick around?
5 minutes max, Will. Sorry, I've got another meeting.
5 minutes. I think it would be quite fun once we got into the swing of things, but please, if you've got another appointment to go to, do leave now. Okay, so I think there's a good question right at the beginning around, is there evidence that if people eat more fruit and veg, they will automatically eat less meat and dairy? Has your research, any of your research, given you any insight on that? Who could answer that question?
Well, Tim, you go. You probably got the detail.
Just quickly on that one.
Yeah. Yes, there is significant evidence, and often it's associated with people being deliberative about increasing fruit and vegetables and reducing meat. But the evidence, for example, that ultra-processed food meat substitutes leads to a reduction in meat consumption is the converse. The more we sell veggie burgers and vegan burgers, the more we sell real burgers. So that seems to be additive. But partly if you are eating a lot of fruit and vegetables, it is full of fibre. It does fill you up. You don't have space to eat the same sorts of amounts of meat, so they tend to be substitutive. But when it comes to easily digestible ultra-processed foods, then that's not the case.
Okay, and then a good question here. Thanks for that, Steve Peel, and a good question here from Joe Noak around subsidies. We haven't talked about subsidies or protection, and I always think that the French were pretty good at protecting their agriculture and probably use CAP to their advantage to some extent in that regard. But what do you think in our post-Brexit agricultural landscape, protection is going to be a very different thing, isn't it? And what sort of protection do you think we should be giving to our farmers, Emily?
Well, the Swiss are particularly good at protecting their farmers as well, which for our Nestle audience here is, it's particularly relevant. So, exists outside of the European Union, like Norway does, because it's got very different priorities for how it incentivizes land use across the country. So, as we go forward, what we are doing, as I sort of briefly mentioned, we're shifting from this system of income support, and where subsidies are focused upon income support for agriculture and protecting businesses and ensuring that farmers have a fair standard of living, to one which is entirely focused on environmental outcomes. And we're only really getting an agri-environmental policy in sort of the format of ELM, the Environmental Land Management Scheme. That means that there's an entire gulf of policy which is basically missing. All of the stuff that was there, which was formerly known as Pillar 2, to do with food productivity, with local economies, with rural development programs, we don't really have clear visibility over where that funding is going to going forward. So I don't believe that sort of protectionism is necessarily the right way to be going when we think about these things. I think we need to think about optimization and sustainability. But within that context, the role that agricultural subsidies play within trade on a global basis is, again, the enormous elephant in the room to understand what gets incentivized, what gets protected, what gets let go, what we expect to extract to be able to consume from the global south. There are so many very, very difficult questions within all of that. But actually, that's why I think the role of global business to regulate itself to be more sustainable is so interesting. And actually what we do at kind of farmer level from a subsidy perspective is perhaps less important.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Emily. I mean, for me, it's all about food standards globally. If we're importing stuff to this country, it needs to be as good, if not better, than the food we're producing here. Yeah. What are your views, Andrew, on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Emily's points. I think a key build for me as well, though, is making sure that those structures don't block business investment as well. One of the big challenges we've seen and are at risk of seeing is that actually by putting the wrong constructs in place, that we actually then limit the ability for business to lean in and effectively support and drive that transition. So we need to make sure that they're enabling frameworks rather than restricting frameworks.
Brilliant. And then just finally, just general point back to this affordability and the sort of levelling up aspects. What do you think, Ika, should because the proportion of the UK disposable income spent on food is very small, isn't it? What do you think we should be paying? Individuals should be paying what percentage?
Well, I wouldn't put a percentage. I wouldn't put a percentage at it, but I think, like, if you think about how important it is for sustaining your life and your health, and if I compare it how much some people spend on other things we don't really need that much, then I think there is a disproportion there. And I think the other point I would make is I come back to what Tim said, and I think as well the National Food Strategy said very eloquently. We shouldn't address or try to address the issue of poverty. Why is it that we are in one of the richest countries on this planet and there are people who don't have enough money to afford healthy food? We shouldn't try to address this problem and try to push it down the food chain and let the farmers pick up the bill. I think, which is what at the moment is happening. It's particularly hard on the farmers. And so I think we need to, and this is my last point on my last slide, is really we need to take a more holistic view and see how we can embed a food system broader in society. How can we embed it in other systems? How we can make it more fair and equitable? And then I think we have a real opportunity for it to deliver more than healthy food, to deliver all those other things, well, you're very, very well aware of, like flood defenses, things we need, carbon sequestration, how we can improve biodiversity instead of ruining it. And there is so much benefits to be had for everyone. I think we just need to come to the table, grasp this nettle, and realize the potential that's there. And then I think, those issues around how much am I going to spend for keeping healthy and well is relative to am I living in a society that is able to pay me enough money to live a kind of half decent life in an equitable society. Yeah. And I think from that perspective, I think we have a lot of potential and opportunity there.
There's a great new term I've just been introduced to called Frugal Hedonism. And the idea that actually back in the 1960s, our lifestyles were far less carbon intensive, but we had a very good lifestyle. Actually, my brother-in-law, I think, might be on the call. He's the perfect frugal hedonist, because he will make you the most amazing meal out of stuff out of your garden, or a garlic, or just a piece of fresh produce, and just totally just have joy of eating a really nutritious, fresh piece of produce. And for me, it's not just money, it's time. It's the time to actually invest in going and picking that bit of wild food and preparing it. So they're the two things, I think, right at the heart of all this. Poverty of time and money. Right, on that point, I think we should probably draw things to a close. Thank you so much, Tim, Andrew, Emily, who might have actually left now, Ica, and also to Victoria and Helen for organising it, and also for Felicia and India, who did some work in the background, and also Niall Bork, who sort of got this going under our Leeds capture sessions. So thanks so much, and look out for the video, and do tell any friends who missed it, point them in the direction of where it is. Cheers then, goodbye, have a good week.
Bye everybody.
Thanks everyone.